Good evening, everyone. Dr. Gary Wyatt, Dean of the Honors College. Welcome to the 2021 Bonner and Bonner Lecture. We are absolutely delighted to have you here. And in this most of unusual years, it's so awesome to be able to continue on with some of our most important traditions. And this lecture series is certainly one of them. Tonight, you'll be really glad you came. We have a wonderful speech. But first, before we do that, I want to give you just a little background. The Bonner and Bonner Lecture Series was established in 1992 and was named in honor of Doctors Thomas and Mary Bonner, ESU's first and second African-American faculty members. The series provides a valuable window to diversity, promoting tolerance and understanding on campus and in the community and throughout the state. We are grateful to former faculty and staff members Beverly Thomas, Dr. William E. King, Dr. Harry L. Stevens, and Camira Maxwell, who recognized the need for this lecture series back in the early 1990s and whose advocacy helped establish it as an important tradition at Emporia State. In 2015, the Honors College, with its focus on adaptive leadership for the common good, assumed the responsibility of sponsoring and organizing this landmark annual event. Consistent with the tradition of the lecture series to promote diversity and inclusion, the role of adaptive leadership in making progress on challenges facing our communities will also be included in each lecture. Well, tonight, we are delighted to have Kaye Monk-Morgan, who has been a college administrator for over 25 years. She holds a bachelor's in chemistry and business, a master's degree in public administration, and is pursuing a doctorate degree in educational leadership, all from Wichita State University. Her dual passions for educational policy and student success were created during her undergraduate years when she held a student position in the very TRIO program she would ultimately lead for 20 years. In addition to her role as director of the TRIO Upward Bound Math Science program, Kaye Monk-Morgan has held several administrative positions, including the Assistant Dean for Students in the Fairmont College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. She is currently serving Wichita State University as the Vice President for Academic Affairs with responsibility, Assistant Vice President for Academic Affairs with responsibility for first-generation student initiatives, strategic planning, university-wide assessment, and accreditation. Kaye Monk-Morgan has served the college access and success community as the Tri-State Chapter President, the President of the Educational Opportunity Association, a 10-state regional membership organization, and 6 years of service on the board of the Directors for the Council for Opportunity in Education, the National TRIO Association, including the term as the board chair. She has served on several local boards and has recently been certified as a leadership associate with the Kansas Leadership Center. And as all of you know, the Kansas Leadership Center and adaptive leadership is a critical part of Emporia State University. While all this is important, what really counts to Kaye is that she is a lifelong learner, teacher, mentor, mentee, daughter, sister, auntie, wife, and mother. She is an aspiring yoga, wannabe long-distance runner, and a tried and true girlfriend. She lives in Wichita, Kansas with her husband, Derek, and young adult sons, Peyton and Cameron. And Kaye, at this time where the world is so divided, we are so polarized, your message tonight will be especially important. We are delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for coming, and we turn the time over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Wyatt, for having me in your space with your students on such a special evening. I don't take for granted the opportunity to share any thoughts or musings that I might have, especially when I get an opportunity to engage the students of the Honors College and so many other Hornets that are in your community. I'm having an opportunity to serve on a committee with some folks who live in Emporia. And so it's a unique opportunity for me, and I'm excited to have an opportunity to be with you all, even if we have to do it virtually. I certainly want to honor and acknowledge President Allison Garrett and her cabinet and thank them for their leadership. The entire Emporia State community, for this particular event and for having me share a little bit about some musings as it relates to the topic for this evening, which is civic leadership and looking at the progress we've made in those spaces. I'm going to share my slide, and I'm hoping that that worked. Yes. Okay, awesome. So, I'm always excited to get an opportunity to have time to talk with students and to talk with folks about things that are difficult. And as you so aptly stated, this is one of those times. We have an opportunity to rise to a challenge in our nation that for many of us is yet unseen and certainly not experienced before. I want to take a moment and just share some acknowledgement of Doctors Bonner and Bonner for the history that they have at Emporia State and being the first. And I'm having an opportunity to learn what it might mean to be the first for any number of folks, either in the educational community or in any other spaces, particularly in mathematics. I was taken aback by that. I did a little bit of research. The Dr. Bonner was a mathematician and his wife an educator, and that they lived in and remained in Emporia for quite some time, about 40 years. And so honored to be in this space and to honor them and their legacy at Emporia. I'm going to start, if I can, with a slightly different introduction. Dr. Wyatt read what I think is a pretty good body of work. I'm excited about the things I've been able to accomplish in a relatively short amount of time. But what I found when we start talking about having difficult conversations, a list of one's accomplishments isn't necessarily what's most best or what's best as a way to provide introduction and to set a course. And so I want to tell you who I think I really am. I am sneakers from Payless and playing outside until the street lights come on. I'm from the kickball field next to Mr. Blandford's house. Green, bright, warm sun on my face. I'm from the creeks and the crawdads that were plentiful under the low water bridge near Bill and Rosie's house, just before the hill of wildflowers. I'm from my grandma's homemade birthday cake and big family dinners, from Shirley and Melvin and Bruce too. I'm from the frank conversations often had and the sharing what we have with others. From life ain't fair and you gotta be better. I'm from God is good and they don't have a heaven or a hell to put you in. I'm from Kansas and Haynesville, Louisiana, from black-eyed peas, fried fish, cabbage. I'm from the shopping with my grandmother in Walmart, picking out garanimals while she figured out the pistol or fingered the pistol in the bottom of her purse, because the men who followed us down this aisle lingered a little too long. Kenny Fields, cousins, and love notes found by my Aunt Sharon, who was the only one who figured out that I was the only one in the room who knew how to spell Kenny Fields. I am from history, mine and yours, black and white, a familiar story, an unfamiliar story to many. I'm from John, who taught us that monks aren't punks, and from Ozell, who always had a hymn on her heart. My experience, I would suggest, is much like those of many of your students, faculty and staff, and the broader community in Emporia State. And in that, I'm honored to be here with you all tonight. The topic this evening is around civic leadership for the common good. And it's a phrase that's often spoken by folks who are engaged in the Kansas Leadership Center. It's a phrase that leading for the common good is something that we're trying to live in within the state of Kansas and to do so with great integrity. And I want to spend just a little time unpacking common good and focusing and thinking about the Bonners and the experience that they had at Emporia State and what it is that they brought to your institution. And so when I think about the Bonners who came to Emporia in 1964 and 1965. And I think a little bit broader around what was happening in our fair country in 1960. Civil unrest, civil rights were at the desire to engage in and have civil rights were at an unprecedented level. Mississippi was burning. Folks were protesting in the streets for their very humanity. And this is the environment in which Emporia State decided to hire, to integrate the faculty at the institution that was serving their students. Not many institutions, particularly in the state of Kansas, were taking such bold steps at that time. We think of these pictures, and I'm going to tell you, this year I'll turn 50, and I'm really excited about it because for some reason that seems like I'm a grown-up now. So 50 is magical. And I can remember as a child seeing these types of photos, some of them in my grandparents' and my parents' home, and thinking, oh my gosh, that's so long ago. I'm so glad we don't live in that world. Only to fast forward to 2020 and find that while so many things have changed, so many things remain the same. Some of the same refrains, some of the same activist behaviors we've been engaged in over the last 18 months, fighting some of the same systemic racism that prompted folks to take to the streets in 1960. We're doing it again in 2020 and continuing that work in 2021. And I can't help but be challenged to think about what are the things that led us to this point? How do we make things better? What is the continued road to progress? If indeed we've had progress, and I'd like to argue that we have. I feel like even my very presence is proof in the pudding that things are different than they were before. But what we know is that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And we know that the winds of change swing high. We know that there's a pendulum effect with regard to politics and education and religion and any of those hot button topics where there may be opportunity for differential thinking. So as I was putting together my comments for this evening, my husband sitting on the sofa, my husband was watching a show on Netflix called Amend. And Amend, if you've not had an opportunity to see it, walks us through the 14th Amendment. And a lot of the work that happened, the 14th Amendment, providing opportunities for folks for citizenship and to have those unalienable rights that our Constitution created for us. And part of the nomenclature and the discussion in this particular series, it's actually a series of shows in this documentary, talks about when, particularly in the racial rectification or reconciliation, rather, of our country, in many cases, we'll see in history, we've taken a step forward and then we take a step back. We take a step forward, we take a step back. So the change is happening, but it's changing incrementally. And so this particular show walked me through 1685 when the slave codes were created and the laws that limited legal rights for enslaved persons, all the way up to 1990, where there's still civil rights legislation that's being passed in the hallowed halls of our Congress and our House of Representatives. And the opportunities or the times in our history where we were able to make progress with civil rights bill or freeing of the slaves, and then we had Jim Crow, and then we have voting rights, and then we roll some of those back. This notion of whatever's happening will come back. And so what I want to posit, particularly for students, is as this pendulum of civil discourse and civil engagement and wanting to make our country a better place, as the pendulum swings, our job is to make sure that we keep up the momentum. The potential energy for making change and the kinetic energy that requires us to actually make change is where that leadership piece really comes to bear. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. In my experience as an African American woman who's around the age of 50 or soon to be 50, I oftentimes see conversations about race that look like this, where people are in safe quarters having conversation about their lived experience without really having an opportunity to engage what we at KLC would refer to as unusual voices. So I want to submit to you and the listeners that if indeed we're going to make progress for the common good meaning for the best interest of all, this is where the work really starts. The conversation around diversity and race, ethnicity, equality means that we've got to listen to unusual voices. We've got to have some cross-pollination in this space. One of the things that really struck me when I first saw this particular graphic, and I pulled it, noted there from the Chattanooga Times Free Press, I happen to have the benefit of having grown up with a white grandmother and a Black grandfather. And so in my lifetime, I never saw these pictures with these groups. I always had the benefit of integration and conversation that was cross-pollinated. And so I'm using tonight the example of race, but I think based on, and I think Dr. Wyatt would agree, there are other areas in our culture, in our communities right now, where the conversations are split right down the middle, whether it's race, politics, religion, any number of ideas or topics, we can find pockets of folks who are talking, but not necessarily talking to one another. And so in the KLC language, we like to talk about talking and working across factions. And really that's all about bringing people with multiple varied values and loyalties to tables to have a conversation about things that might be difficult and being willing to do that work. One of the things that I've had a unique opportunity, or what I believe to be a unique opportunity to do over the last 18 months in particular, is spend a lot of time in an effort to energize others, maybe not in the streets and protests, but in dialogue and discussion about how do we make progress on one of our most difficult issues of racial inequality. How do we engage folks in learning and having conversations others than those they might have for themselves? And it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle. We like to talk about leading in this area will require us to have much in the way of courage, to be vulnerable in spaces that we may not necessarily have comfort, to trust in a process that we did not create, and to bear witness to the multitude of vantage points, interpretations, and points of view on any one particular issue. I had a history teacher once while I was in college, Dr. Anna Chandler, much like the Bonners, I imagine in my mind, who once shared with us in class that in her mind, history was like an accident at a four-way stop. What you see depends specifically on what corner you're standing on. An accident at a four-way stop. What you see and what you report is much like standing on a corner and only seeing an accident for one side. And in order, what we know is that when there's an accident at a four-way stop and the police officers show up to take a report, they get a report from each one of the corners. They ask everyone who's witnessed any number of things to share their particular opinion, their vantage point. The interpretations are floated in the space to create a narrative that's inclusive of everyone's experience. I see this, Dr. Chandler's metaphor, as the way I live my life. And I want to encourage our students to think this way too. Just about everything that we come across in life is an accident at a four-way stop. And our ability to converse, to make progress, and to lead on these issues means we need to go stand on another corner. Now, that sounds pretty easy. I am a proud Wichita High School, North High School graduate. My parents graduated from North High School. My grandmother volunteered at North High School, which there are four, all graduated from North High School. And you all aren't in Wichita, so you might not follow Wichita news, but just recently, our school board thought it appropriate to change the name of Wichita North High School's mascot from the North High Redskins to a name yet undetermined. North High runs through my veins. It's an important part of my history and my identity. I still have North High t-shirts and sweatshirts and go to games. My oldest son went to a different high school. And so when his school played North High, on occasion, I sat on the North High side. I bleed red and white North High. And it broke my heart to hear that we were changing our name. And it made me proud to know that we were. I stand on a corner where I can have multiple opinions about an issue of diversity and be highly connected to the work without having to decide universally that there's an argument that's right and an argument that's wrong. And in order to be able to help make progress on issues like that, I contend that we've got to be able to have conversations. And so I watched, some of you may be members of Facebook groups of your alumni or your high school or your folks. And I watched the not even partisanship, but the separatist ideas of those of my colleagues or alumni who felt very strongly in one category and those who identified in another category, of those who said change and those who said didn't, and just never did the two cross. Well, in order for us to make progress, we've got to bring groups together. There's got to be a willingness to see the issue at hand from another corner. Now, I grew up here in Wichita. I'm the oldest of 28 grandchildren, 28. And 24 of us grew up within a 4-block radius of one another. Fantastic way to grow up. That notion of community and personal accountability and accountability for your neighbor was an underlying premise in my entire upbringing. And so my grandmother is one of the most key central figures in my entire makeup. And my grandmother was a short little woman, African-American, with very strong Native American features. Her grandfather was Cherokee, and she was the type of the African-American woman who would wear the matching outfit that had the matching hat, that had the matching Bible cover. And when she met you, she would pray for you almost immediately before she even knew your name. But my grandmother had some really strong advice around what leadership was. She never went to KLC. And so she never said the words out loud that you've got to energize others. But she would say to me, Kaye, you're the oldest. We would meet in the morning to go to school on the corner in front of my grandmother's house, all 24. So before there was a gang problem, there were the Mayberries. We would meet together, count off, and walk to school, 2.5 blocks, cross the patrols, go off to school, get our work done at the end of the school day, repeat the pattern, cross the patrols, meet at the corner, count off, and make our way back home. Except for I have one cousin, and any of you got cousins, you might be able to identify with this. That one cousin who always had to stay after school because she just could not behave during the day. And one day I decided I was the leader, but I wasn't really ultimately all that concerned about whether or not Rochelle made it home or not, because I wasn't going to wait for her anymore. I was frustrated, ready to go. So I traipsed down the street with the other 22 of my cousins, each of us dispersing into our homes around the same time as usual. And as soon as I walked in the door, the phone rang. My grandmother could literally stand at her kitchen sink and look and see my back door. When my cousin Rochelle did not walk in the house, my granny called me and said, "Kaye, where is Rochelle?" To which I said, "Granny, she's still at school. I left her." Might have been about 12. Granny said to me, "Kaye, if you're the leader and you turn around and the people who are supposed to be following you aren't there, you are no longer the leader." My granny never went to KLC. She never had a lot of training, high school diploma. But even then, she knew that the job of leadership is energizing others to make progress. I needed to energize my cousins and get them from point A to point B. In order for our country to continue to grow, for our community to grow towards the common good, we need to make sure we bring everybody along with us. We can't leave one because they behave inappropriately. We have to take the time to encourage, to bring people along and recognize that the folks that are standing on other corners aren't bad people. They're just on other corners. I love this graphic, and I use it often. Those of you that have engaged in conversations, and I know that my colleagues in TRIO programs there and Emporia State, I know this is true of the folks in the Honors College, are heavily engaged in helping our young people to understand as they go out and not just inherit the world and live in a real world. I believe college students are living the most real experience ever. They're doing the work, and they do the work on our behalves every day. The notion of being able to stand on one corner and observe and understand what's happening in someone else's shared experience is one of those true leadership skills that I think every student, every person needs to have. It requires all of those concepts that KLC, the framework, teaches us about. It requires us to understand that leadership is an action. It's not a position. It tells us that there's going to be some risk. It tells us that we're going to have to own some stuff. So when I think about how I've led in this particular time and what it must have been like for the Bonners, who showed up in the middle of Kansas in 1964, a lot of difficult conversations in the midst of the civil rights movement, taking a lot of time to explain to those folks who were willing to hear and who had a concern and a heart for the work of making progress for the public good. I think about that, and I think about it often. And I think about what we mean when we say we want to make progress. Well, progress isn't linear. Progress is messy. It takes a while. There are starts and finishes and stops. There are experiments throughout the process. So when we think about this notion of diversity and having difficult conversations, one of the things that I had a conversation with my eldest son. I have two sons who are the most awesome young people in the world, 23 and 21. And we have done a fairly good job, I think, of raising verbose and opinionated young people who have very little money in their pocket, but still have lots of opinions. And some of you may understand what that's like to have young people that have opinions but no money in your homes. But we have encouraged them to challenge us on those things that we hold true. Because one of the things we've learned this year, and I don't know about you all, but I've learned that there were a lot of things that I thought were absolute fact February of 2020 that I know are falsehoods in March of 2021. And some of that has come as we've pulled some threads on those things that we held dear. My children do the same thing for me, as they pull some threads on those things that I hold dear, giving me an opportunity to be challenged and to rethink some things. But I go back, I digress. The Bonners, upon their entry into education in 1964 and 1965, I wonder what it is they expected their experience to be. I spent some time just focusing on what are the conversations that we're having in 2021 and 2020 that might mirror that language. I'm reminded of a conversation. I had several friends who called in the middle of the protest over the summer to say, Kaye, I'd like to have lunch with you, or can we have a cup of coffee? Because I'm really struggling with what's happening in the middle of our streets. I don't understand what the concern is. And the number of times I had the opportunity, and I dare say the responsibility, of explaining, as an African-American female woman who's given birth to two African-American young men who are navigating this space and watching it happen every day, I have a responsibility to help my white friends or my non-African-American friends understand this experience from my corner. And it came at a cost. I don't know about any of you who've ever had a conversation, a difficult conversation, where you've got an opinion or an experience that might abut the experience or the opinion of someone with whom you share, you have positive feelings and positive regard for, but you come at an impasse and have to figure out how is it that we move forward in these spaces. That risk, that personal vulnerability, maintaining and managing our triggers and those things that might put us aside, are absolutely key to helping us to make progress, even though it's not linear. And so I think about the Bonners. I think about what are those tools that I've learned that help me to navigate these spaces. My grandfather, John W. Monk, one of my most favorite people in the entire universe, lived to be 102 years old. I had the gift of John W. Monk for 47 and a half years. And every day he poured into me. He poured into me, and he would share stories. My grandfather was a military veteran who served our country in the US Army for almost 30 years. He was a business owner, but he also was a young man who fled his home as a 14-year-old with what we would identify as a middle school education, because his brother argued, not hit, but argued with a white man. And his mother feared that his older brother would be lynched, and dispatched my grandfather to take his older brother to Wichita from Haynesville, Louisiana. And I had the opportunity all of my life to hear him talk about the experiences, that pendulum, right? From 1964, when the Bonners showed up and there are protests in the streets, to almost 2020, when yet again we have protests in the streets. You talk about the experience and then what he has seen, and what the way the pendulum swings, and how sometimes it's easier to be a person of color and other times it's more difficult, and how it is that we've yet made progress in spite of yet the pain. And he gave me some lessons to live by, and I actually wrote them down. I was fortunate enough that we had cell phones before he passed away, and so we would get him to talking and telling stories, and then we would tape them so that we would have that oral history, which is such a strong piece of the African-American culture. And my grandpa told me a couple of different things, particularly when it came to having conversations that were difficult. And he said, first, Kaye, educate people when there's value in doing so, but you get to decide when. And my grandma would always chime in and say, you know what? Because she had a Bible scripture for everything. Don't cast your pearls to the swine. Those folks that can hear your story and can interpret your story from your heart, tell them who you are. Show them who you are so that they can have a reckoning with any dissonance they might have about difficult conversations and being able to trust. My grandpa told me that use your actions, not your words, to show others in the room that you're there based on merit. I was really concerned in my life that I had to be over prepared, or I had to make sure that I had all my ducks in a row in order for people to accept me. And my grandpa said, you know what? It's not about them accepting you. You prepare so that you're your most confident self when you show up in the space. You don't owe anybody anything when you get there. You're already in the room. You're already in the room. He said that my job as a person of color could be, should I decide to accept it, right? The matrix, if I decide to accept it, to help facilitate the learning of others. How do you do that? Depersonalize it. It's not about you. Somebody's just on another corner. And from where they're standing, they can't see what it is that you see, and they've had a different lived experience. To that end, he said I needed to be humble and make sure that I gave space for other people to show their authenticity. And in fact, he didn't tell me this. He told my son this. He was overhearing, sitting in his chair the way he oftentimes did, watching his great grandchildren play a very rigorous game of Uno. And they were talking about being authentic and their authenticity and being awake and woke and paying attention and engaged. And he told them, you know what? It's great for you to be authentic. I made that up. Authentic. But are you good at accepting other people when they show you who they are? If the rule is that the world has to accept you as you are, make sure you're humble enough to be able and willing enough to accept other people the way they show up at face value. Powerful, powerful lessons. Use your actions, not your words, to show others that you understand their experience. Again, we don't talk about what it is, the theoretical framework of what it means to lead in these spaces. We have to demonstrate that work by showing people that we're paying attention. And then our job is just to ensure, my job is to ensure that the students that are graduating from Emporia State have an easier road ahead than the Bonners had, and frankly, than I've had. Having difficult conversations is indeed difficult. It challenges us intentionally. If indeed we want what's best for the public good, and the public good includes all of us, by very definition, we're going to have lots of expectations about what that public good is. The one best way to help create a shared impact and collective understanding is through having difficult dialogue. And so I want to encourage those of you that can and are navigating spaces where difficult conversations are available to you to be willing to accept that challenge and to move forward in those spaces with grace. I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts with you tonight. I'm honored again to be here with you and to honor the Bonners and the tradition at Emporia State University. And I know that I have an opportunity that there may be some questions or some additional discussion. So I'll yield back to Dr. Wyatt.
Thank you very much, Kaye. That was an absolutely wonderful remark. One of the tragedies of the pandemic is you don't get to hear everybody clap. But if we could, there would be lots of clapping right now. That was really, really inspiring. At this point, myself and Kushiganshi, Vice President of the Honors College, will be happy to ask questions that people are submitting. And then we have a few others that have come in otherwise. Kushi, do you see the questions?
I sure do, and we do have a question. Do you want me to say it?
Yep. Go ahead.
Oh, I was on mute. I'm sorry. The question is from Rebecca Buffman, and it says, you have talked about the importance of taking the time to have conversations. One second. To have conversations and engage with others in order to be a leader. How do you think the concept of cancel culture influences the opportunity that we have to educate others and take the time to engage, even those that may not agree with our stance? In your opinion, is there a place for cancel culture in leadership, or is this something that is actually contributing to a polarized society?
Fantastic question. I had this conversation with our 23-year-old last night as we were watching, or not last night, this week as we were watching The Bachelor, because we've been quite taken with all that's happening in Bachelor World. It's the first time we've actually tuned in. I think there's learning in every experience, especially those folks who have opinions or thoughts that may differ. And so I'm loath to say that I'm a proponent of cancel culture, and I'm willing to admit that my humanness makes it really difficult for me to negotiate my humanity. And so on those things where my humanity as an African American woman or the humanity of my children are challenged, it's really difficult for me as a person who's trying to practice leadership to differentiate and to give space for that. And so I'll give you an example. Tearing down Dr. Seuss, the issue this just last week was that there are 6 Dr. Seuss books that actually the Seuss estate has determined will no longer be published because of the content and the portrayal of people of color or people of different religious backgrounds. Is it cancel culture to remove 6 books that put in the minds of children or allow children to think in their minds a certain way about a group of people? I would say, yeah, there's 100 other books that Dr. Seuss put together that don't do that. So can we find better ways to educate our children? Absolutely. Do we burn them? No. But do we give them to kids? Probably not. A teacher education program is a great place to use that particular resource to show teachers the impact of the materials that they have and that they use with their children. I think there are things that in our country we have done that harm people at their very core. In some cases, I would argue that cancel culture really is about challenging people's behavior and holding people accountable to that. Doesn't mean we get rid of them. Doesn't mean that we don't listen to what it is that they have to say. But it also means that we have to clearly identify that this particular notion of humanity is not one that is operationalized in our society. So where I personally start to struggle is when the rhetoric attacks my humanity. And then I think at that point, we have to put up some boundaries. So I'm practicing in this space. I'm not an expert. I'm just telling you kind of how I'm addressing it and how I've had to in order to maintain my sanity. Because frankly, if everything that people say about my people is true, I can lose my mind. So creating some boundaries in that space. But so I don't know if that helps.
Thank you very much. And just for all of the listeners out there, you can submit questions at emporia.edu/live. Many of you know that, but if you don't, you can certainly do that. Okay, so here's a question that just came in. I recognize the name, Kushi. Your presentation was really, really impactful. How have you managed yourself in conversations that might have been triggering or too close to home?
Yeah.
Do you have any advice on being more vulnerable in order to have meaningful conversations?
Thank you for the question. I think you absolutely have to be vulnerable to have the conversation. And for me, one of the things, again, my grandfather shared that if indeed you're going to be a teacher, his word, I interpret that as leader, you've got to be willing to be vulnerable and to let some things in. So I told a group earlier today, I don't know if there's any Star Trek fans or Star Wars folks in the audience tonight, but any one of those big warships have cloaking mechanisms, right? And so when you're cloaking, for me, when my cloaking mechanisms are intact, I can handle just about anything. But on any given day, if that cloaking mechanism isn't working well, it's harder to manage myself. It's harder to have a colleague say something and not be responsive to, but to be educational, because I'm human, right? And sometimes people say stuff that hurts your feelings, or that gets under your skin, or that allows you to, or as my grandma would say, would take you out of your home training. So I work really hard to be transparent. I work really hard to tell people I'm going to give you the best that I've got, and some days it's better than others. I live in my humanity and the fact that I'm practicing, and I determine when it is I want to be educational and when I can't. And I'm very clear with folks. There are some people that you can try to help educate that none of that's going to even make a difference. So me being exposed and being vulnerable doesn't really help. It only exacerbates the situation. So I think you get to choose when you want to be educational. I can remember being a young African-American woman and people wanting to touch my hair. I was on a cheerleading squad, and I was the only African-American. I'm often the only African-American in any number of spaces. And just the conversation of when you're having a sleepover and you do something different with your hair at night than other people do. There were times when I'd be like, yeah, you can touch it. And I would explain some things. There are other times when I'm like, you know what? I don't feel like it. And so the reality is I set those boundaries. This is when I'm willing and able. And when I'm not, I just say that I'm not. I can come back to you next week and we can have a cup of coffee and talk about it. But today, we're not going to do that. We're not going to have that conversation.
Thank you. Here's another question. Major economic forces in the media and social media create, sustain, and benefit from the divisions that we are experiencing. Yeah. And this often happens without us realizing it. What do we do about those forces?
Yeah, I think we got to we got to recognize that they're there, right? My grandma would say, tell the truth and shame the devil. We have to acknowledge that in some cases we're being manipulated. And we have to do our own research. And we have to live in grace and give grace, in my thought, right? So yes, there are people who have a belief structure that's different from me. But if I can find but one exception, that means it's not all people. So I spend my life looking for the exceptions to those things that some people will say are the rules. Understanding the very point of divisiveness makes money. It's a cottage industry. Not allowing myself to be sucked in, challenging those things that don't support my lived experience, and then going to the balcony, if you will, when I see things that don't resonate because of the corner that I'm on, questioning those things in such a way that I can really start pulling some threads to see where that's coming from. So I think we've got to be much more inquisitive and curious about any number of the types of media that we take in.
Thank you. One more great question. Kushi, can you get the first one?
Yeah, for sure. This question is from Kristen Geiger, and she's asking, how do you prevent burnout while also being so vulnerable in these conversations?
Yeah, you have to have safe places. And to be really transparent, I cry because I have feelings and it hurts. And there are times when I say, I don't understand why my white friend doesn't get it. I had a colleague once, I shared a story. We live in a predominantly white neighborhood here in Wichita, Kansas. And right around the time, some of you may remember, Trayvon Martin was murdered. Young African-American man, a young man who was walking home who had on a hoodie. And that summer, I removed every hoodie that my children own. gave them away, every hoodie in our house. And my children cried and could not understand. And I just explained to them, could not have the same experience as some of their friends, because when you run down the street in a hoodie, people shoot you. Jack can run up and down the street in a hoodie and not be questioned, or Alex can run up and down the street in a hoodie and not be questioned. And so it's painful. It's painful to have to explain to my friends, these are not, you don't have to have some of the same conversations with your children that I have to have with mine. But when I tell them the mother heart, whether Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, LGBTQ, whatever, the mother heart is the mother heart. And mothers understand and can speak to one another in fear for your children. And so while she hadn't had that particular experience, she could understand what it meant to have fear about her children's lives. So I think just the notion of understanding, it's going to cost, because leadership does.
Thank you very much. Another question from Kaylee Gleason. How do you start to meet people on their corner?
Yeah, they have to invite you. You can't just show up on somebody's corner without knocking on the door and saying, hey, I'm going to come over and take a look there. So I have a good friend who did me the favor of demonstrating how you get on another corner. He simply called and said, I'd like to talk to you. Can I have a cup of coffee with you? To which I said, absolutely, sure. What are we having a cup of coffee? I've never had a cup of coffee with this guy before, but he trusted me enough to ask me. So I said, yeah, absolutely. I'll meet you there. So you ask, you share. I have a different lived experience. So I'm going to take a risk, and I'm going to ask you a question that will help me. And I know that this puts the burden of educating me on you, but I'm going to ask you to do that favor for me. And I've not ever had a person tell me no.
Thank you. Kushi, do you see that next question?
I do indeed. This question is from Dr. John Ella Holmes. And the question goes, while we live at the intersection of Black and women, how do we demonstrate boundaries without getting the angry Black woman label?
Yeah. Hello, Dr. Holmes. So good to know that you're in the universe out there. I don't have a good answer for this because in my lived experience, you all can't see me because I'm seated, but I am literally 6 foot tall. I'm not a big woman, but I'm a long woman. My granddad used to tell me he stretched me, and that's why I got to be so long. And so I've actually had people tell me that I'm intimidating, which is one of the worst things that you can hear as an African-American woman, because that's the flip side of, or the opposite, or the same side of the coin as you're angry. And my response has been, I'm not intimidating, you are intimidated. And so let's unpack what it is about my presence that makes you feel that way. Because I got to give that work back to the person whose work it is to do. I try really hard not to own that. I say that understanding that I'm super conscious of, if I'm the person who's going to say this, it's going to come across this way. So the whole notion of anyone can lead anytime, anywhere, yes, and it may look different. I may have to tell a joke. Frustrates me that I have to diminish myself in a way to do that. But in some cases, it benefits if it helps us to make progress. So I don't know that there's one fail way to do that. I don't know that I'm always successful. There are times when I come home and I am concerned that I came across as the angry Black woman. And there are some times I am angry. And I think that's okay too.
Thank you. We have a question from Michael Torres. Thank you for joining us this evening. I wonder, let's see, wait a minute here. I just pushed the wrong button. I wonder if, I'm not being able to see that for some reason. Can you see that, Kushi?
Yeah, I can see that. Do you want me to read that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, for sure. It's from Michael Torres, as Dr. Wyatt said, and it goes like this. Thank you for joining us this evening. I wonder if you could speak to approaching these conversations and creating these environments in our higher education institutions, as we enter the workforce in a company, nonprofit or other, and in our communities as a larger group based on your experiences? Are there safe spaces with mediators, community open forums, surveying, for example?
Yeah, I think there are. There are. I was asked to do some stuff for Bank of America not long ago. So corporate entities, I think, get it. And they get it because, to one of the other speakers' point, it's a money deal, right? There are profits that go unmade, uncaptured, until and unless we can bring people together. And so while there are folks who understand that they profit in our separation, there are also folks who understand that there's greater profit in bringing folks together. And so I do think that there are I don't want to say that there are safe places or safe spaces. I think there are places in corporate and in nonprofit and the work world that are courageous places where you can have some conversation. Are they safe? Depends on what you're safe from. I don't know that I would suggest that. But I do think that you all are graduating or coming out of post-secondary, going into a workforce where there's a lot more conversation than there was in 1960, and a lot more than what there was when I came in the workforce 20 years ago. And certainly you have a great opportunity, I think, to leverage the moment of time that we're in right now.
Another question from one of our professors, Andrea Luthi. Do you have any advice for how people in a position of authority, like a professor, can have difficult conversations with those in a different position, like a student? How do you prevent the difference in position from influencing the conversation? Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, there's rarely an opportunity I have that I don't refer back to something that one of my professors said. So understanding first and foremost the role, not just the functional role of educator, but the lifelong role that our faculty have and the opportunity to leave fingerprints on the hearts and souls of the students that show up in their spaces, I think is pivotal. I would go back to that humbling piece. And while there are certainly differentiations on hierarchical scales and authority is a real thing in a space that we have to name, I think there's also a humanity that people look for and can connect with. And I think a humble spirit that is giving grace and having a conversation allows another humble spirit to gracefully accept. And even when it goes wrong, it's still right.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much. We have one final comment from Dr. Holmes, and I think Dr. Holmes speaks for all of us with the comment, beautiful and honest explanations. So thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. This has been an absolutely wonderful evening. The insights you've offered have really been important and impactful, and I think have touched many, many of us. So thank you, Kaye, for your generosity and for your wisdom and for your willingness to be with us. Oh, wait a minute, we do have one more question.
Okay.
So Kristen Geiger, how can the younger generation connect with the older generation to have difficult discussions on hot topics? We'll have that as our final question for the night.
Yeah. You know what, Kristen, I'm going to tell you something that's going to seem it's going to be hard for you to do. I'm going to say, listen, ask a question, and then listen and ask a follow-up. I had the benefit of sitting at the knee of a person who was 102 years old, who was born or his parents were enslaved. And I can tell you that the number of times my grandpa told a story that in our back of our heads, we would roll our eyes and say, okay, here's that same story again with the same moral. Those are the very same stories that I recount now to thousands of people a year because they're so powerful. And so I think that the desire to earnestly understand before seeking to be understood is the way to go. Ask a question, listen in earnest, ask follow-ups, and then give your response. And it's just an opportune time to not miss out on a bunch of wisdom.
Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions, and we are so delighted and honored to have had you be with us tonight.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Gary. I love it. Go Emporia, Hornets.
Thank you very much.